So November's UGS Talks, Insight into Disability and Research, is part of the University Disability History Program, which takes place between 16th of November to 16th of December 2023. You'll be able to find 2 links in the chat where you'll find more information about the rest of the university program, but also the National Program of Disability History Month. So stay tuned and find more information via the links on the chat. In the UK, 1 in 7 students share information with university about having a form or multiple condition of disability. So it's a very important topic for us in higher education sector, but also in society at large. It's the responsibility of everyone to make sure that our campus environment and also workplace is accessible for all, in particular in a context here for a postgraduate community. This event, we will explore current research into disability and neurodiversity, inclusive research design, and the lived experience of being a disabled and or neurodivergent postgraduate students. UGS talks are held online for accessibility. We will have closed captioning. You can click the buttons on your screen for closed captioning function. A recording will also be made available afterwards as well for people to watch it as a catch-up. Please feel free to post questions to your speakers during the speech, during the keynotes and panelist conversation via the Q&A functions on your screen. We will pick up questions and do the Q&A at the end of this presentation. So without further ado, let me introduce you the first keynote speech, which will be delivered by Dr. Andrea McLeod, Neil Hall, and Barbara Sandland. They will be talking about their projects, Neurodiverse Students Within Higher Education. So Andrea is Associate Professor of Autism in the School of Education. She researched models of support for autistic adults, especially those with Asperger's syndrome, that promote self-efficacy and autonomy. Before joining the university, Andrea worked in the voluntary sector and supporting adults with disability. And Neil is a lecturer in social, emotional, and behavioral difficulties in the School of Education, with research interest in learning and teaching in higher education and student mental health. He has worked as a psychologist for the NHS, NSPCC, and for courts and tribunals. And last but not least, Barbara Sandland is a PhD student with us in the School of Education. Barbara's research looks into the experience of people who have self-identified as autistic. So Andrea, Neil, and Barbara, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sammy. Thank you for inviting us, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here. This is a great event. I have to say, I have the least role in this. So my kind of role has been that I was the supervisor to Barbara, and I was the project lead for this really nominally because it has really come from Barbara's experience, and she's done the vast majority of the work, and I hope you'll enjoy hearing about it. I'm going to hand straight over to Barbara.
Thank you, Andrea. Initially, we were going to introduce ourselves, but Sammy did such a good job. I'm not sure if we need to do that now. Probably just a slight amendment is I'm not a PhD student anymore. So I've done that. I've passed my PhD now. So I'm now a postdoctoral researcher at the university, and I work in the Disability Inclusion and Special Needs Department. So we're going to talk about today our project that we did last year, I think it was now. I'm not very good with concepts of time, so bear with me. I think it was last year. To managing it, I'm going to do the vast majority of the talking, but I'm really hoping that Andrea and Neil will butt in and add the detail that I forget as we go through. So if you want to go on to the next slide for me, can't remember who's doing that. One of the first things we were asked to talk about was how were PGRs or PGTs involved in our research. And I think mapping it through, I can give you lots and lots of examples, but I think probably one of the first things to talk about is the fact that I was a PGR when we started this process. And I'm a neurodivergent individual with physical disabilities as well. So the difficulties, the challenges I was facing as part of my process really fed into this research and really looking at what were the challenges and what were the systems in the university that supported that, and where the gaps were and where more support was needed. So the initial idea very much came from my Viva. As Andrea mentioned, she was my supervisor, Neil was my examiner. So we sort of we worked together, building up to the Viva, to build a system to ensure that support was in place so I could manage that environment. And then afterwards, we've gone through this process of evaluation and sort of going, okay, well, what can we learn from that process? And how can we impact further in the future for other PGRs and PGTs going through that process? So the idea right from the start came from our experiences and our the work that we did, and we've built on from that. So we developed this research to really explore how neurodivergent students were experiencing the PhD journey, what support they needed, what support they were getting, and what support they weren't getting, and what could be done better in the future from it. I'm going to talk about methodology in that a little bit on the next slide, which will cover how we included PGRs and PGTs in that methodology process. But it really was based on a foundation of shared experience. We wanted students to be telling us what their experiences were, and constantly feeding that into everything we did and the outputs that came out of it. So it constantly was this participatory approach where we were getting feedback and building everything based on those foundations. We really didn't want to just go, this is my experience and therefore that's what everybody needs, because we know that's not factual. We wanted to build that evidence basis. So if we just go on to the next slide, please. So methodology wise, we had a mixed methods approach built across phases. So the first phase, you can see there, we did semi-structured interviews with neurodivergent students, we did semi-structured interviews with some staff, and we did an online survey. So really trying to get a breadth of experiences across the university about the Viva process, how students had experienced it, or what concerns they had coming up to it. And from the staff point of view, what they knew about it, what they knew about neurodivergence and how it might impact on the Viva process, what support systems they had put in place, and where they felt like they might need some more advice from it. I've put the percentages on there just to give you a rough idea of this was across the whole university, and it was really important to us that we didn't just focus on College of Social Sciences, where we're all based. We wanted to really look at all the different elements of the university and the different fields and the different experiences that students might be having. So we gathered all our data around from that and from the experiences. And then the second phase, when we started developing resources and developing proposals of what we could do with our research, we used those students and staff to consult. So it wasn't a case of, okay, we've analysed our data and therefore we know the answer. We developed ideas and then we went back to our participants, or we went back to people in the university going, okay, we've got this idea, or we're proposing this. What do you think? Does this reflect your experiences? Is this right? So we've got that constant engagement with people across the university to make sure that everything that we're talking about is accurate. I'm going to the next slide. So I just wanted to go through some of the findings that we found within the first phase, because it's the most interesting bit, let's face it. And this is where students were telling us about their experiences and the difficulties they faced when developing reasonable adjustment plans or accessing support because of varying different neurodivergencies. Bear with me, my brain kicks in and my mouth gets to the point where it's going to make sense. So one of the first things we find is that in order to gain a reasonable adjustment plan, you've got to have a diagnosis. And that in itself can be a barrier, because we know in the UK at the moment, the waiting lists to get diagnosis are excessively long. So people can know they've got challenges, and they can be pretty confident they are neurodivergent, but they haven't got a piece of paper to back it up, and therefore they can't get the formal reasonable adjustment plan. So that in itself becomes a barrier to accessing support. Linked in with that, we've got this idea of disclosure. So people can have a diagnosis or not, but know they are neurodivergent, but actually disclosing that to somebody is a challenge. And people talked about a vulnerability that they felt in sharing that information, because there's a risk. You don't know how the person's going to respond to it. And this was really, really important with the postgraduate researchers state level, because quite often their supervisors or the people that they had to disclose to were potential future employees. And that then becomes an additional barrier of, well, I don't want to share it with them because that might stop them offering me a job in the future, or I'm not quite sure how they're going to respond, so therefore I'm not going to do it. So even with a diagnosis, even with all the information that would entitle them to support, students were sharing, actually, I'm not doing it. And that then becomes a barrier to accessing the support. Another element that was really important was this idea of self-advocacy. Our reasonable adjustment process and most reasonable adjustment process are based on the assumption that students can self-advocate, that they can tell you what they want, why they want it, and get you to do it. Our reasonable adjustment process requires a student to be asking for reasonable adjustment plans to be reviewed if it needs to be reviewed. So it's requiring the student to self-advocate for that. Even if a reasonable adjustment plan is in place, they've got to say, no, actually, this isn't working. I've got to change something. And that can be a barrier in so many different ways. Students were saying, actually, I don't have the confidence to say that. I don't have the confidence to fight. I don't have the capacity to fight. So it's that extra spoons, it's that extra level of challenge of, I've got to send all these emails, or I've got to talk to somebody. I don't have the capacity, I don't just have the emotions to deal with that, emotional space. But equally, it could be, I just don't know what I need. And we have this assumption that because somebody has got a diagnosis, they must know where the challenges are, or what they want done about it. And a lot of our students saying, I just don't know, especially if I've never experienced that before. A Viva is a very unique situation which most people don't experience until that stage of their journey. So how do we know what support we're going to need in that situation when we've never experienced it before? Picking up on some other things, so the cost benefit analysis was a really interesting area that came out of it, and wasn't something we thought about before, where students were saying, actually, I make a judgment call. So I've got to decide whether the benefit of receiving reasonable adjustments outweighs the cost to me of seeking them. So quite often when you hear people say, oh, reasonable adjustment plans gives them an unfair advantage, or it wouldn't be like that in the real world, or it's easy. And actually the students were saying it's really not that. And actually, if I am asking for them, I've gone through that cost benefit analysis and I've decided that I've got to do it, even though there's all these negatives associated with it. And I think that's really important when we talk about implementing research and that, and appreciating the impact on the student and all the different things that are going on for the student in order to get that support. We know there's a whole paperwork bureaucracy sort of side of it, and that ties in with the cost benefit analysis, it ties in with the self-advocacy, it ties in with the extra effort it takes to do these sort of things. And then staff were very open and very honest and saying we need more training in this area. We're willing, we're just not necessarily able. So I think it's really important to recognise that it's not always it's easy to say it's the staff member's fault. But actually, if we're not training them in this area, if we're not giving them the information, then they can't do it. So it's the same as the student doesn't know what they need if they've never experienced it. It's exactly the same for staff. They don't know what they can do if they've never experienced it. So I think it's really important to see the two sides of this dynamic. Is there anything I've missed on that, Andrew, Neil, that you want to come in with?
You haven't missed anything, but can I just add on to that, Barbara? One of the things that came out of this that was, I think, really powerful was that disclosure is often talked about as if it's just telling somebody information about your disability in a very kind of neutral, non-emotional way. And one of the things that came out of this very strongly is that for a lot of people, it's actually that people are often newly diagnosed. They might have never disclosed to someone. And the way that university systems are set up for, with the best intentions, can result in people basically having to over disclose, so that they're having to disclose repeatedly to everybody who they might need some accommodations from, and that people found very, very difficult, particularly if they were still trying to process a new diagnosis and deal with the reality of that. So that was one of the things. And then the other thing, just to say, sorry, Barbara, if you were going to say this, was one of the things that was great about this was that we kind of thought that we were in a little corner, and the people we would be kind of struggling to get people's attention on this. And what we found was that there was a lot of interest across the university and a lot of recognition of the need for this kind of work to take place in terms of looking specifically at reasonable adjustment plans for PGR students. And I thought that was a really positive thing, that there's a kind of a real enthusiasm from staff across the university for this kind of work.
Yeah.
Sorry, I hope I haven't stepped on something you were about to say.
No, not at all. That's perfect. Okay, if we go on to the next slide then, because I'm very aware of time. So the whole point of doing this project was to have an impact. This wasn't a research project that was designed just to write about our experiences, although we did write about our experiences and that article is out there. We wanted to impact on the university and impact on the students that will be going through this process in the future. One of the first things we actually did, and it's probably a little bit daft that we had to do this, was we realised there is no definition of neurodiversity across the university. And when we were talking to different people saw it differently, and that reflects the literature. There is no definition of neurodiversity out there, so we weren't unique in that sense. But we thought it was really important that we agreed what we were talking about when we were talking about neurodiversity. So we did come up with a definition with the recognition that neurodiversity is a socially constructed term, and therefore the definition will adapt and it will change over time as society develops and new knowledge comes out there. So the definition that we use is on, if I jump down to the bottom, on the web pages that we also developed. So there is a resource out there now that's freely accessible to everybody about neurodivergence and neurodiversity in higher education. It is just a collection of other people's resources. This isn't something we've created from scratch. It's a collection of videos and articles and links to blogs and podcasts, very much a person first basis of knowledge. But that information, hopefully, and that will impact on the staff training element of it. So we really wanted something out there that staff could access and students could access to start that knowledge building activity, although we recognise there's more to go with that. There's more that needs doing. So we did that, and again, as I said, everything was through consultancy, so we were getting feedback all the time from people of, does this reflect what, do you agree, do we need it changing, do we need anything adding? So alongside that, then we started looking at the university guidance and policies. One of the things that we recognised when we were looking at reasonable adjustment plans is actually there's a real repetition in the type of reasonable adjustments that are being suggested. And some of the reasonable adjustments that are being suggested aren't reasonable adjustments, they're just good practice. And if we did that for everybody, then we wouldn't need the reasonable adjustment in the first place. So one of the things we found out when we were doing our literature review and through the students' experiences was that pretty much everybody under the neurodivergent umbrella requires additional time to process information. And that is a really, really frequently added reasonable adjustment, that the person should be given extra time to process the question in the Viva and produce their answer. Now, the Viva isn't a time-restricted examination, so there is no expectation that you have to do anything in a set period of time. So why is that a reasonable adjustment? Why can't we just say everybody gets the time they need, don't rush them to answer their questions, everybody's great, it covers everybody then, and by putting these things in place, we're supporting people that haven't yet got their diagnosis, so can't get a reasonable adjustment plan, people that don't want to disclose, so haven't got a reasonable adjustment plan, and people that don't fit under the neurodiversity umbrella, but may need support. So if somebody where English isn't their first language, they need a little bit of extra time to process the wording of the question and formulate their answer. So these sort of provisions help everybody. It's a universal design for learning. So we developed a list of principles that we thought, actually, this would cover everybody. If we just adapted this for everybody, it would solve a lot of problems. And we consulted with staff and students on, what do you think? Does this work? And that has been presented to the university now to say, let's make these adjustments and let's make the whole process a little bit more inclusive for everybody. By doing that, we then enable the reasonable adjustment process to be a little bit more personalised. So we're not just giving blanket reasonable adjustments for everybody. So, for example, I had a reasonable adjustment for my autism that was exactly the same as a reasonable adjustment for one of the students that had a speech difference. And I can hand on heart say that we are very, very different people, and it's illogical that we've got the same reasonable adjustments. So enabling that sort of setup means that we can then approach a reasonable adjustment plan, which is a little bit more personalised to the individual, rather than the generic diagnosis. On top of that, we also then developed a student letter prototype, and this very much is in an infancy stage, I would say. If you want to go on to the next slide, I can show you some images, which may not be very clear, but we'll talk you through a little bit. So the idea of this letter was to enable the neurodivergent person to have that conversation with their examination team about, I am neurodivergent, I'd like you to know about it, because if you know about it, I'm going to worry less about how you're going to interact with me. And therefore, I feel like that conversation is going to be a little bit more positive. And it's for the more informal things that aren't going to be covered on a reasonable adjustment plan. So the first section is about awareness and acceptance. So it's, I want you to know about this and just accept it, basically. So, for example, I want you to know I'm not going to make eye contact with you. There's nothing you need to do about it. But if you know I'm not going to make eye contact with you, I'm not going to then sit and worry that you think I'm being ignorant or ignoring you. We're going to have that shared understanding. And that just takes that level of anxiety off a little bit. So the first section is all about awareness and acceptance. And then the second section is awareness and action. So I want you to know this about me, and I'd really like it if you did this. So it may be, for example, I really don't like shaking hands. So it'd be really great if you didn't ask me to shake hands. And if you do, if you know that in advance, I'm going to take that anxiety off. So as I said, this letter's very much in its infancy stage. Our next project is developing this and trialing it. And actually, I think there's potential. There's a lot of interest that this may go beyond the Viva and how we can adapt this. I've already got people talking to me about how we could use it in a placement setting. So when a student goes out to placement, how could we use it to engage those sort of conversations? So that's our next project. You've got my email address on there. If you'd like to be involved in that, please email me, because everything we do is about collaboration. So we've got this idea, we've got this basis, but it's really, really important to us now that we start getting more and more student feedback about, would this work? How would it work? How would you use it? How can we develop it? Is it visually accessible? Is it practically accessible? All those different type of things. That's what we want from it. And then you've got very last slide, which is just our references, which is the boring bit. So you can flick that up, and then those are our articles that I mentioned earlier.
All right, thank you very much, Barbara, Andra, and also Nero for your contribution, a very important piece of study in how we can make our environment more inclusive for postgraduate students with disability conditions as well. So next, we have 3 postgraduate students sharing their experience and also the discovery about a range of different topics, as we mentioned today. So we have Dayla Jason, we have also Fia Hatton, and also we have Kit Richards. So Dayla research used machine learning to predict the visual behaviors of people with vision impairments when they interact with a given computer screen to understand how and why they interact with screen and user interfaces. Their research aimed to suggest improvement to the design and accessibility features of screen. And then Fia's work is, Fia is very passionate about supporting disabled and neurodivergent postgraduate students in her community. And in 2022 to 24, Fia is one of our UGS scholars for PGT community. Her interests focus on disability and transhumanism in science fiction and films. Last but not least, we have Kit. Kit's research explores the representation of dwarfs in a range of classics, including Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. So the work looked into a potential impact of this representation may have on society's attitudes towards people with dwarfism. So again, so let me first introduce you, Dayla. Thank you very much for your contribution.
Thank you, Sammy. Hello, everyone. So first, I will speak briefly today about my project, which is, as Sammy mentioned, understanding the effects of vision loss on visual search for people with vision impairment when they interact with a given user interface. Next slide, please. Briefly, I'll speak about vision and vision impairment. So the human eye works by perceived light that are reflected from objects. And in vision impairment, the ability to see is decreased to a level that cannot be corrected by wearing glasses or contact lenses or medically treated. And based on the World Health Organization, there are 2.2 billion people who are considered visually impaired, and the majority of those people are over the age of 50. And something important in my research is the eye movements, which is the complex set that humans use when they search for a target or an object, for example, looking for a person in a crowded room, or searcher for, like in terms of computer screen, searcher for an icon that is surrounded by like other icons. Next slide, please. So in my research, I focused on 3 types of vision impairments, which are cataracts, where the person experiences blurred visual field, as the picture on the right, like top right. And another type is age-related macular degeneration, or AMD, where the person experiences visual loss in the center of their visual field, as the picture on the bottom left. And lastly, glaucoma, where the person experiences loss in the prefer visual field as the last image here. Next slide, please. So my research goals are to use machine learning methods to build a model of impaired visual perception. So, I mean, understanding how and why people with different type of vision impairments, such as glaucoma and AMD, interact with a specific user interface. And by why, I mean, features on the screen, like the distance between objects, the features of the objects, and by how, I mean, the eye movement, features such as the accuracy and search time and so on. And the long-term goal of the research is to assist build a more accessible user interface based on the design, rather than adding additional tools that the visual impaired would need or additional features. So we focus on the design. Next slide, please. So an example of my experiment, how they work, is that I find an experiment that was done by researchers in psychology. For example, in this experiment, it was done for people with glaucoma, and they were asked to find a target that is located in a wide visual field to test their peripheral vision and how they interact with this visual search task. So in this experiment, the people were asked to find a human face that is located on either the right or the left side of the person, and the face was the target was located in a different distances in the visual field. So so in my research, I take this experiment and implement it as a machine learning model, and then I compare my results with the result of this experiment and see how close the model is to the human behaviors. Next slide, please. So this is an example of my results. So in this graph, I tested the accuracy, and the lines are the results of my model, and it's just the average, and the bars are the human data. And as you can see here, like, we are a bit close, not exactly, but like the average is that the model predicted decrease in accuracy as the distance of the target increased. So that's briefly my research. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you, Lizzie, for inviting me today.
All right, thank you very much, Stella. So next we have Thea.
Hi everyone, I'm Thea. I'd like to start with just like a brief introduction of my wider project, because this kind of falls under it as a subsection, I guess. So I'm researching transhumanism and posthumanism in science fiction media in general. I'm trying to take a media agnostic approach to not being pinned down specifically to literature, which is my background, but moving over into stuff like video games, TV, and film. And I'm really interested in how storytelling under capitalism and neoliberalism affects how we can imagine different futures for ourselves. But the talk for today, can I have the next slide, please? Thanks. So transhumanism is an unnecessarily wordy word. It's just an umbrella term for a lot of different schools of thought. So it's not one combined philosophy like it sometimes sounds. The unifying factor is that they're all concerned with the concept of human enhancement through science and technology. So think about when you see cyborgs and things in sci-fi. Those are kind of the obvious example. But what's meant by enhancing will differ from school to school, and how they go about implementing those things will differ greatly. There's a model called democratic, which thinks it's only acceptable to do transhumanism if it's accessible to everyone, regardless of their background or like financial situations. And then there's libertarian on the other side, which is kind of transhumanism under capitalism, is the best way I can put it. They think people have a right to profit off of them. Could I have the next slide, please? So these are just some obvious transhumans that I picked out. Robocop, Darth Vader, and Soups and the Boys. But now's the kind of time when I'd like to just point out that transhumans aren't only restricted to sci-fi. Transhumans are here now. People with pacemakers, for example, that's a technology that's completely changed the way that we live and completely like radically altered life expectancy for some people. Even glasses, like there's a bunch of transhumans in the audience right now, I can see. Glasses are a technology that we developed and that's changed the way humans function. So I'm really interested in not trying to consider sci-fi to be too distant from us, but it's rather just a continuation of the technologies we currently have access to. Could I have the next slide, please? So some tropes that I've kind of picked out in my research with science fiction and transhumanism interacting with each other. They're normally either speculative technologies, so technologies we don't have yet, or just more advanced versions of our own. It's commonly shown on screen in terms of prosthetics or sometimes genetic modification. So when you see a robot arm in science fiction, like Luke Skywalker gets spoilers for a 30-year-old film, that's transhumanism. That's he gets a new hand, changes the way he can operate. But there's a really interesting lack for me in terms of how transhumanism is often thought to be like fixing disability and how disabled characters who don't have their bodies altered in some way are left out almost entirely of science fiction, and how that kind of worryingly reflects some of the views in transhumanism that I don't necessarily agree with. Next slide, please. So yeah, this is kind of a trend that I've noticed in transhumanist work. Is this kind of idea about fixing. A very prominent one, Zoltan Istvan. He actually ran for president after he created a party called the Transhumanist Party, and he ran for the president of the United States under it. Very odd guy. But he suggested in an article that we should be repairing disabilities instead of sidewalks. And he takes the argument that that would save the public money. Obviously a very troubling suggestion, very, I don't know, like driven by capital. And I think it really misunderstands how technology can be used to benefit society and specifically disabled people. It's very condescending. It's definitely an external view of us pointed in. Next slide, please. So yeah, that kind of brought me to think about who has the power to shape technology. Who has the power to shape technology? At the moment, I'd kind of lay it mostly in the hands of tech companies, medical institutions, and governments in terms of legislation and what they currently allow and what they don't allow. But these are all very long-standing existing power structures that have a tendency to reinforce things like sexism, ableism, misogyny, racism, homophobia, any list of the E's. So I like to take a different approach with my transhumanism. I like to bring in like new feminist and sort of disability theory. The one in particular, the Xenofeminist Manifesto by Laboria Cubonics, again, hard words. They argue that technology should no longer be used in the interest of capital, which is only ever going to benefit few people. They really sort of prioritize democratizing it and maybe even going beyond democratizing it, sort of bordering on communist theory here. But yeah, I think if we want technology to be able to help people instead of reinforcing power structures, we have to consider how those people can shape the ways we design and deploy technologies, and build it more from the ground up in terms of users instead of companies trying to make a profit. Next slide, please. Yes, so liberatory potential. So like I said earlier, technology's already changed the ways we go about liberation quite a lot. Thinking of like phones and social media. Phones are often not thought to be a transhumanist technology because they're not like injected into the body as much, but transhumanism doesn't just have to be interacting with the body. It can be, you know, a social tool. I think we've always been transhuman in a way because humans have been defined by technology language arguably is the same thing. Language is technology we developed. Sorry, I'm talking out. But yeah, so phones and social media have completely radicalized the way that we can go about resistance, and they've really enabled disabled organization in a way that I don't think was or could have been possible for a very long time. It's sort of taken a community that used to be very isolated and given us more of an opportunity to connect with one another, which I think technology, when guided in the right direction, has the power to do that. And if we can, as disabled people and as neurodivergent people, shape the technologies more in our own interests, then we can see it being more of a radical tool. Thanks, that's me.
So thank you very much. So also have Keith. So Keith, we'll talk about now from screens, from images to text, right?
Hiya, can everyone hear me? Grand, lovely. Hiya, yeah, so I'm Kit, and my thesis is kind of tentatively titled Practically People, Dwarfs and Dwarfism in Modern Fantasy. I'm sure the title has already changed 1,000 times. I'm sure it will change again, but that's what I'm going with for the moment. I just wanted to highlight as well that my email address is on there. I'm very happy if anyone has any questions later to talk about this further. If I could have the next slide, that would be grand. Fantastic, thank you. So yeah, just kind of research areas and interests. So I am neurodivergent, I self-identify as autistic, and I'm currently going through an ADHD diagnosis, which, as Barbara has already said, is going to take probably the rest of my life to work through. So if there are any questions, I'm happy to, respond and bring my experience to that. Also, a lot of my rap and everything is based on an anxiety disorder diagnosis that I had way back when. So I'm happy to talk about that. And I'm also actually at the beginning of a leave of absence for poor mental health. So if anyone's interested in that process, I can speak to that. But in terms of my research, I did my undergrad and my research master's at the University of Birmingham. I've just stayed and I'll stay forever if I can. And my MRes was in medieval studies. So I'm initially a medievalist, but I'm looking at more modern literature for my PhD. So my MRes was on chronic illness and impairment in Old English literature, and I focused on saints' lives, penitential literature, and law codes. So things like judicial impairment and stuff like that. And just some things that I'm particularly proud of. I've gotten a publication in a postgrad journal, which is about disabled and racialized bodies in a 14th century Old Norse saga. So that's using kind of discrit, which is like an intersectional view of, critical race theory and disability studies. And I've also recently given a paper at Oxenmoot, which is the Tolkien Society conference, about staturization in Middle-earth. Staturization being the process by which urban environments are staturized, are made for people of certain statures or heights, and how that impacts accessibility and people's well-being. If we could change to the next slide. Lovely. So yes, so the my PhD thesis in general is an exploration of the fantasy dwarf archetype and its development over time. So I kind of start in the Old Norse and then go into more modern fantasy, and I look at how the humanity and personhood of people with different embodiments are either denied or affirmed in the works of William Morris, Tolkien, and then Terry Pratchett. And the quote from my thesis title, Practically People, is a reference to Terry Pratchett's book, Men at Arms, where a human says to a dwarf, I've got nothing against dwarfs, mind you. I mean, dwarfs is practically people in my book, just short of humans almost. So looking at that interaction between, people with different embodiments being non-human, but if they're not human, are they still people? And my reason for doing this study, when I was doing my master's and after my master's was finished, Game of Thrones was very popular. And so Peter Dinklage, the actor who played Tyrion Lannister, was in the public eye and kind of talked a lot about the impact that fantasy has on discrimination against people with dwarfism, and how people of typical height respond to the kind of stereotypes within fantasy and use that as their basis for understanding people with dwarfism. And from that, I read the work of Eugene Grant, Cara Reedy, Kathy Rea, and Karuna Stammel, who are all activists and journalists with dwarfism who have talked about their experiences. They are, you know, things like having people shout like "hi ho" after them in the street and things like that because of the way that Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs has come into the kind of zeitgeist. And then just a shout out to Tom Shakespeare, who not only has a great name, is an incredible academic with dwarfism who has written like basically thousands of things, and his research is excellent. And Erin Pritchard is a more recent academic with dwarfism who has talked about urban environments and engaging with that as a person with dwarfism. If we could have the next slide. I realize I'm running out of time. Sorry, but yeah, so my methodology is the cultural model of disability, and these are some definitions of key terms, impairment and disability. And I essentially use this to look at how, you know, fantasy dwarfs aren't impaired. They tend to be able-bodied, strong, you know, axe-wielding creatures. But when they are in human societies, they experience social discrimination and are disabled by other people. If we have the next slide, please. And then this is just a breakdown of my chapters. So looking at how William Morris used the medieval in his writing, how Tolkien responds to that, and how Tolkien kind of popularizes the concept of fantasy races, and then looking at how Pratchett satirizes this with more of a focus on kind of civil rights to question the kind of non-human depiction of people with different embodiments. And yeah, sorry for going over by a minute, but I've got a bibliography as well on the next slides if anyone wants to just shoot me an email. So thank you.
Thank you, Kit, for your sharing. So, so any one of you have questions, please feel free to post it on the Q&A. We have a couple of minutes for questions. I noticed that a few of our attendees asked questions, want to know from our speakers about the concept of the social model of disability. And so it's a generic question to all. And how do you find about the social model of disability in terms of self-identifications, or as a process of diagnosis, or in terms of reasonable adjustment process and so on? Do you feel it is something that widely acceptable and have a consent within the disability community, or is something that is still very much a fragment understanding as an overall picture? So anyone from the speaking panel would like to talk about it? So Kit.
Hi, yeah, sorry, I can't actually see the question, so I'll just answer from my memory of you reading it out. Because the social model of disability was something I originally started using in my master's thesis, and then my supervisors was like, you should look at the cultural model instead. And so I've been looking a lot more at the cultural model, and I think it's interesting because while the social model of disability is so very, very important for policy and has been so transformative in so many different spaces, but I know one of the key issues there is that it creates a binary between impairment as like a neutral physical condition, which obviously if you're neurodivergent or whatever, that can kind of have a bit of issues there. And then it separates it completely from disability and says that all the bad stuff comes from society and, you know, lack of accessibility, which is, you know, true, that is terrible and makes things really, really hard. But I know the cultural model kind of really sought to look at accepting impaired people's own personal experiences and lived experiences, which acknowledges that impairment can suck. You know, as an autistic person, there are lots of external things that makes my life really hard, but there are other things like, I don't know, getting what's the word I want? Like overstimulated, that also can really suck. So this cultural model kind of accepts that there can be things that the individual person can find very hard about their condition or whatever. It's not just the fact that society is and capitalism and things like that is terrible. I don't know if that answered the question, but maybe that helped somehow.
Yeah, thank you very much, Keith. One final question because of time. We have questions to the panels of speakers. Any one of you have already got the next big idea for your future research topic about disability? Anybody is happy to share some future insights for our audience who are interested to know about your next idea and topic in mind?
I can jump in with that as a bit of a sales pitch, Sammy. Barbara's already talked about us trying to extend the work that we've been doing with PGR students in relation to developing universal design for learning and collaborating with PGR students. So we're very, very interested to hear from PGR students and see what they think of the suggestions before, you know, they kind of go forward to be put into practice, hopefully. As part of that, there is the student tool that Barbara described. So that's what we're doing from a PGR perspective. But you've also just started another project funded by TASO, transforming access and outcomes for students in higher education, which you've been very helpful with, Sammy. And so for that one, we're looking at undergraduate students and transition in. And that's not just around neurodivergence, that's disabled students and how they can have more productive conversations about their reasonable adjustment plans using the personal tutor framework, because all students have a personal academic tutor. And so what we're trying to do is, again, it's a collaboration. So we want to consult with students and staff across the university and get their help to develop resources, which we are hoping to develop in a mirrored way, so that those two sides of things, the staff, what the staff are doing and what the students are doing, kind of match to create a better experience. And as part of that, we're hoping to develop as well a student self-advocacy tool, so that students really have support to take ownership of that process. So I think that's it from me.
Thank you, Andrea. Yeah, very interesting. Like, keep up with the good work, everyone, as well. So to our audience, so please scan the QR code for feedback. We really want your feedback about it. I know quite a few of you already sent how fantastic and lovely to hear the lived experience and the research topic. And please let us know. Your feedback will help us to create the series even better for the years to come. The University Graduate School support Birmingham's postgraduate researcher and postgraduate taught community. In particular, we foster an interdisciplinary community and act as a gateway to support and advise with a range of events throughout the year designed and to develop your postgraduate networks and skills. So please go to the UGS Eventbrite page to find more information and future activities. And if you would like to hear more about from postgraduate students about the range of innovative and impactful research happening across the university, look out for our postgraduate research almanac exhibition online and at Westmere House between 29th of November to 4th of December, which showcases postgraduate research from all disciplines and how it relates to different spaces and also aspects of the academic years. So thank you very much for your time again, and hope you enjoy your weekend, the rest of the day as well. Goodbye.